So as a company, would you rather be in a perfectly competitive market? Would you rather be a monopoly, or would you rather be a monopolistic competition? As a society, would we rather have industries that are perfectly competitive, monopolies, or monopolistic competition? So we're going to answer those questions by looking at some of the challenges of the monopolistically competitive market. And in order to help us uncover this information, let's look at that perfectly competitive market, the monopoly, and the monopolistic competition. Now, if we're going to look at some of the problems with monopolistic competitions, we said early on the perfectly competitive market was the benchmark that we compare all these other markets to. So if we're going to look at challenges with monopolistic competition or even problems with monopolies, we need to understand some of the benefits of perfect competition. So what were the benefits of a perfectly competitive market? Allocative efficiency, productive efficiency, encourages innovation, costless system, economic freedom. So let's focus on the first two. Let's look at productive efficiency and allocative efficiency. Okay, so what do those mean? Productive efficiency. What does it mean that when you do production, when you produce your good or service, you are efficient? Well, we are productively efficient if we are producing at what? Our lowest per unit cost, right? So productive efficiency is when you are at your minimum average total cost. So when we think about that perfect competition, in a perfectly competitive market, let's just draw our graph here. So, perfectly competitive market. Average fixed cost, average variable cost, average total cost. All right, in a perfectly competitive market, you're going to produce until price is equal to marginal cost. We know that in the long run, where is that price is equal to marginal cost? So in the short run, the price could be up here. You're making economic profit. But in the long run, we end up where? And here's our quantity. We had a name for that quantity. What was that called? Economic capacity. Right? This is the quantity at where the business is the most efficient, as opposed to this quantity where the workers are the most efficient. Economic capacity is the quantity where our business is the most efficient. And we end up at a price that's break even, no economic profit in the long run for perfect competition. Okay, so the perfectly competitive market, was it productively efficient? Yes, because we end up here where the price is equal to the minimum average total cost. So in a perfectly competitive market, it is productively efficient. What about the monopoly? Is it productively efficient? Well, let's go back. We had said that a monopoly, right, is going to produce until marginal revenue equals marginal cost. It was going to go up to the demand curve. And that price, where we end up there at $13, is that at the minimum average total cost? Is that where the business is the most efficient? Well, here's where minimum average total cost is, and we're not there. Now, a monopoly has barriers to entry or exit. So in the short run, they are not productively efficient. What about in the long run? Well, in the long run, the graph looks exactly the same if you're a monopoly. So the monopoly is not productively efficient in the short run or long run. What about the monopolistically competitive market? We said in the short run, the monopolistically competitive market acts like a monopoly. Only difference is this is demand for your product. Well, if it acts like a monopoly in the short run, we end up where the quantity is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and we go up to the demand curve. Are we at minimum per unit cost? No. So the monopolistically competitive market is not productively efficient in the short run. What about the long run? Well, in the long run, we said that the demand for your product would decrease and would flatten as you were no longer different from the competition. And we noted that you would end up here. We are now on the long run average cost curve. But are we at the minimum of the average cost curve? Where does the minimum of the long run average cost curve occur? It always occurs where it intersects the marginal cost, because remember, if the marginal is above the average, it pulls the average up. And if the marginal is below the average, it pulls the average down. So the monopolistically competitive market is not productively efficient in the short run or the long run. So as a society, we like perfectly competitive markets. Why do we like productive efficiency? Because if the business is acting at its most efficient, if it's operating so that it's at its minimum per unit cost, then what that should mean is as the cost goes down for the business, the savings get pushed on to the customer. And it means lower prices for the customer if the business is operating at its lowest per unit cost. So from a society and a customer perspective, we like perfect competition because it's productively efficient. Monopolies and monopolistically competitive markets intentionally produce less so they can charge more, but the impact of that, of course, this is where my software is going to crap out, is that it causes that point to be at a higher per unit cost. I'm just going to restart this program here since it crapped out on me. So the next benefit of a perfectly competitive market that we're going to look at is that of being allocatively efficient. Let's go back to our list here. So what does it mean to be allocatively efficient? You are allocatively efficient if you use your scarce resources to produce what people want the most. So how do we know what people want? Well, that's the demand curve. And how do we know that businesses are producing what people want the most? Well, what businesses produce is the supply curve. And so it is this equilibrium point here where we are allocatively efficient, where we are producing what people want the most. So if we go back to our perfectly competitive market, what set the price? The price was set by supply and demand because each individual was a price taker. And so because we end up at a price that is on the supply curve, that made the perfectly competitive market allocatively efficient. Well, where is the supply curve for an individual company? So this is the market supply curve. Where's the individual supply curve? Well, remember, that's the marginal cost curve above the shutdown price. So when we look at allocative efficiency, what we're looking at is where supply and demand intersect, and we're looking essentially for that point where price equals marginal cost. Now, perfectly competitive markets, we end up there. What about monopolies? Okay, so monopolies, are they producing at where supply and demand intersect? Are they producing where price is equal to marginal cost? Well, what price did the monopoly end up charging? You'll notice here, right, our price was 13. Are we on the marginal cost curve? No. Are we supply and demand intersect? No. So the monopolistically competitive market is not allocatively efficient. Monopolies intentionally produce less so they can charge more. We're not using our scarce resources to produce what people want the most. We're producing less than what people want so that we can charge more. Well, what about the monopolistically competitive market? In the short run, the monopolistically competitive market is acting like a monopoly. So are they allocatively efficient? Are they where supply and demand intersect? Is our price on our marginal cost curve? No. So the monopolistically competitive market is not allocatively efficient in the short run. Okay, what about the long run? In the long run, we said the monopolistically competitive market produces a quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And then they go up to the new demand curve, and that would be the price. So notice that that price they're charging, while lower than before, right? Because the price before was 13. Now we're looking at a price of about $9. It's lower because they're competing more on price because they can't differentiate their product. But is it allocatively efficient? Are we using our scarce resources to produce what people want the most? No. The monopolistically competitive market is not allocatively efficient in the short run or the long run. Notice this point that we're looking at here is not where supply and demand intersect. Our price is not on the marginal cost curve. So, no. All right. The third thing we want to look at is the idea of economic capacity. Before we do that though, so from a society perspective, which market do we prefer based on allocative efficiency? Well, society wants us to use our scarce resources to produce what people want the most. So society likes perfectly competitive markets because we are making what people want. Monopolies and monopolistically competitive markets intentionally produce less so they can charge more. Now, if you are the company, which one would you rather be? Well, you'd rather be the company that can charge a higher price, okay, make a bit more money. And so if given the choice, you'd rather be a monopoly or a monopolistic competition instead of a perfectly competitive market, because you can intentionally produce less and charge more, and you have more market power. Perfectly competitive markets have no market power. All right, let's look at the idea of economic capacity. Economic capacity, of course, is the quantity where the business is the most efficient. So, where does that quantity occur? That quantity occurs at that minimum average total cost. So economic capacity and productive efficiency go hand in hand because they happen at that same quantity. So the perfectly competitive market we saw before operates at economic capacity. We like this because the business is the most efficient. What about the monopoly? Are they operating at economic capacity? Well, here's the quantity that is economic capacity. You'll notice the monopoly is intentionally producing less so they can charge more. What about the monopolistically competitive market? The monopolistically competitive market acts like a monopoly in the short run. So again, they're not producing at economic capacity. They're intentionally producing less so they can charge more. What about in the long run? In the long run, there's a decrease in demand. The demand curve flattens out because you're no longer different. You're now competing more based on price, but you're still not at economic capacity. So just like with the productive efficiency, the perfectly competitive market operates at economic capacity. Monopoly and monopolistic competitions do not. The fourth thing we want to look at here is the idea of economic profit. So when we look at economic profit, the perfectly competitive market makes economic profit in the short run, but not the long run. Long run being defined as the moment when all of your costs become variable, when those contracts end, when the leases expire, and then you can have flexibility to change your operations. So perfectly competitive markets have economic profit in the short run, but not the long run. This is why businesses would prefer not to be perfectly competitive markets. All that competition and competing based on price means that they're not making more money doing this than other activities. Well, what about the monopoly? We know the monopoly makes economic profit in the short run. We can see that here. And we know that because there are barriers to entry, legal, technical, and economic, the monopolistically competitive market makes economic profit in both the short run and the long run. So given a choice as a business, we'd really prefer to be a monopoly instead of a perfectly competitive market. Well, what about the monopolistically competitive market? In the short run, the monopolistically competitive market acts like a monopoly, so it makes economic profit in the short run. In the long run, others copy you. You're no longer different. You're now competing based on price. You end up on that long run average cost curve, and so that economic profit goes away. So the monopolistically competitive market makes economic profit in the short run, but not the long run. This is why if you are a monopolistically competitive market, you are constantly trying to differentiate yourself, because as long as you are different, you are making that economic profit. It's when you are no longer different that economic profit goes away. So given the choice between being a monopoly or a monopolistically competitive market, a business would rather be a monopoly, short and long-term economic profit. Given the choice between monopolistic competition and perfect competition, you'd rather be monopolistic competition because you can sustain that economic profit as long as you sustain your differentiation. So perfect competition, no market power, no long-run economic profit. As we start to look at these other types of markets, they gain market power and they gain more sustainable economic profit. So to summarize that, the problem with monopolistically competitive markets from a society perspective is that they are not productively efficient. They are not allocatively efficient. And they are producing at less than economic capacity. They intentionally produce less so they can charge more. The benefit of being a monopolistically competitive market from the business's perspective is that you can maintain that economic profit as long as you maintain your differentiation.